Let's just go back to that. How proud are you that it all worked out the way it did?
Yeah, so I guess you're referring to the Kyle Tucker trade, and anytime you have the last few first rounders in the big leagues, that's a source of pride for all of our scouts. That gives all of them a lot of purpose and inspiration when they come to Chicago next week. And then our goal is to draft good players, and ideally we'd love to see them out here from kind of an emotional standpoint. But the reality is that we know not all of them are going to be out here, and some are going to be playing for other teams. And to the extent that we can help Jed and Carter, with their construction of a championship caliber club, we're all in.
What was that moment like when you said Cade Orton's pitching, Matt Shaw's at third, Camp's in the other lineup? Just that moment watching that series, it seemed like you said, all three of those guys.
There were a lot of texts going back and forth amongst our scouting department during that game. It's everybody's just. It was like a kind of a postseason game for our scouts. They're seeing the guys that they just drafted out there compete in the same three of them at one time, which is pretty rare. So it was a lot of fun.
What's the strength of the draft this year?
I would say high school position players. I think when you think of the four demographics, high school pitchers, high school position players, college pitchers, college position players, I think it's probably from the first pick to the 20th pick, high school position players.
Is there one area that you are targeting?
Hard to say right now. It's hard to have a target at 17. It's more like a reactionary position where wait to see how it unfolds in front of us. We don't have the spending power of a team with a top third draft pool. So that combined with where we pick in the first round, it's really hard to kind of control your own destiny there. We can probably just hurry up and wait that a lot of guys that are high up on our list end up getting to the 17th pick.
Dan, how do you think things have evolved for your department since your first draft in 2020 to now?
Yeah, I think in 2020 it was an opportunity to experiment with a lot of things and to try different approaches that otherwise we wouldn't have been able to try. I think once 2021 rolled around, the models evolved quite substantially. Even since then they're evolving year over year, but I would say from 2021 to now, the same basic infrastructure of kind of our analytical backbone has remained fairly constant. I think out in the field, that's something that probably changes more rapidly just because, with more technology coming seemingly every single year, and which means more data, it means we have to reorient, what we're asking our scouts to do out in the field. And so if we're not sort of asking ourselves every year after the draft, how can we do things better, and making changes, I think we're probably falling behind. So I think the kind of what you're seeing out there in the field probably changes every year. I don't want to say drastically, but noticeably, and will continue to, is my guess. But what we're kind of our analytical backbone underneath the hood in the office has remained pretty constant since 2021.
The inexact science of drafting a college pitcher and the wear and tear we talked about a little bit about yesterday, but the Carlos Rodon stories about everybody's won one year and then the next injury caused people to hesitate. How much time does that take with you guys, and just looking at medicals, talking to Jed and Carter, and really getting a feel for, well, this guy gets over this hurdle, he's a difference maker.
Yeah, I think pitching injuries is a really difficult problem to solve in any procurement channel, whether it's the draft, whether it's trade market, free agency, because at the draft, at the bottom end of the procurement level, if you take the stance that pitchers are too risky because they're getting hurt more often, well, that just means on the other end of things you're going to have to spend more, whether it's trade capital or dollars. So I don't think it's something that, even with an increasing prevalence of injuries, for pitchers, I still don't think it's something that you can avoid. I think we have to deduct it in our model and account for it somehow. But if we're not drafting arms, we're just going to have to go get them somewhere else and potentially a different market. So I think we just have to be aware of it, make sure we're studying it, make sure we're on top of how healthy a player is coming into our system, and mitigate that risk if we can. It's really difficult, but we're certainly not going to stay away from pitchers because of that.
When you see someone like Jackson Wiggins kind of come back and have the year he's having, I mean, how much is monitoring those individual cases then informing that approach in the draft? Because obviously that was a risk when you took him, and now you see it's paying off right now.
Yeah, I think when you can identify a pitcher that has an injury history, even a recent one, and then recognize that his stuff might be trending upwards, I think that's something that you tend to pay attention to and want to zero in on. And that's what we did with Jackson, where he was injured, and that's what we did with Cade actually as well. These guys were injured, and then coming off that, we're starting to trend upwards. Jackson was a little bit different because he was more in a rehab setting, but we saw that trend line, that pretty steep trend line right before it went down. And if you think you can get somebody that is going to come into your system and still be on that steep positive trend line upwards, I think that's something that we're going to still try to identify this year.
On a similar note, when you're thinking about pitchers in particular, how much do you look at how a pitcher's been used in their amateur career? I'm thinking about Cade Anderson throwing 130 pitches in a College World Series game.
Yeah. It's interesting because you think back to when the draft was a little bit earlier, and you'd end up drafting players that are in the College World Series and throwing 120, 130 pitches, and you're kind of just holding your breath. At least now, we have the benefit of being able to see that prior to the draft. But no doubt, I think a pitcher's workload factors into our assessment of what their future health might be. But the reality is, it also allows us a glimpse into how they can navigate an order 2 or 3 times through, and we get a better feel for how the longevity of their stuff and how durable they might be. So there's pros and cons to it.
Go back to your picking at 17.
Yeah.
The last 4 years, you've been around that. You've had success with Jordan, with Cade, with Matt, with Cam. What is the equation to go into being we're comfortable picking here, we're comfortable getting a big league caliber batter, big league caliber arm?
Yeah, I think, as Derek can attest to, in St. Louis, we were picking in that neighborhood quite a bit. And I think it's a pretty interesting sweet spot in the draft where you can have access to some of the better talent. Certainly not maybe the top 3 guys, but you can't really rule out the majority of the draft pool. So I think from that standpoint, it's exciting because you can, expect somebody to fall to you or drop to you that maybe you otherwise wouldn't have. But I definitely think that if the higher you pick, the more money is associated with your draft pool, and the more flexibility you have, the more creativity you can have. So so I think there's pros to it, and we try to look at the glass half full there. But it's going to be a long night, waiting for 16 players to go off the board in front of us.